The Economist is almost 200 years old. It's one of the most prestigious magazines in the English language. But when its editor-in-chief interviewed Tucker Carlson, she crumbled.
Clearly, I think you and I agree, we have both been critical of the Israeli government. I just want to kind of clarify terms a bit here.
Well, I've really been critical of the Israeli government.
I've been plenty critical of the Israeli government. I've told you at the beginning that we were against this war.
What do you think of Gaza?
What do I think of Gaza?
Yeah.
I think the war in Gaza, to start with, was a perfectly reasonable response in response to the horrors of October 7th. I think now the places, I mean, I've been there. Have you been to Gaza? I've been to Gaza since the war started.
They would not
it's
let
catastrophic.
me into Gaza. Trust me, very few journalists get into Gaza.
Yeah, no, I went with the IDF. It's the only way that you can go in, but nonetheless you go in and you see a flattened place. I think it is a disaster for the future of Israel, a disaster for the Palestinian people, a horror, 70,000 people dead.
Why would you describe it first as a disaster for the future of Israel? You've got tens of thousands of civilians murdered, but it's foremost a disaster for the future of Israel? No, it's foremost a disaster for the families of the dead kids.
Absolutely. I made 3 points.
Because everybody sucks up to Israel in this way that suggests they're afraid. And everyone is afraid, and you know that. Everyone's like, the real problem is calling people anti-Semites allows real anti-Semites to flourish. It's like, no, actually, the real problem with calling people anti-Semites who aren't is accusing the innocent of a crime they didn't commit. And the real crime in Gaza is killing people who did nothing wrong. So those are the real problems, I would say. But no one can say it because you have to be like, oh no, but really October 7th
I don't know what you're talking about, Carlson. We're having a...
Everyone watching this knows what I'm talking about.
It is true. Everyone watching it does know what he's talking about. I mean, you know, it's a shame watching Tucker Carlson in an interview and thinking that he's coming across as the more reasonable person. There's many unreasonable things about him, which we'll sort of talk about later when we talk about what this means for centrism and liberalism, that it's getting snookered by a man like Tucker Carlson. For now, when Zanny Minton-Beddoes, that's her name, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, she says she's been plenty critical of Israel. You know, I've even been to Israel. I've even been to Gaza with the IDF, of course, but I've been there. We should look at some of the coverage of the Gaza war from her newspaper. So on November the 2nd, when more than 8,000 Palestinians had been killed, thousands of them children, The Economist argued that Israel must fight on. We were told to ignore the Israeli government's genocidal language and instead see this as an anti-terror operation with some collateral damage on the side. Then in January 2024, when South Africa accused Israel of genocide at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, this was The Economist's take. Charging Israel with genocide makes a mockery of the ICJ, and it diverts attention from the real humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which is just an incredible attempt at sort of gaslighting. We're opposing the claim at the ICJ because we think that if Israel were found guilty of genocide, it would make it harder to protect the people of Palestine. How does that argument work? Of course, and as Zanny Minton-Beddoes said in that clip, the reason that they argued that Israel's war against Palestinians was justified and why it must continue and intensify is because the war was seen as a response to the horrors of October the 7th. The problem here, The Economist hasn't exactly reported on the events of that day accurately. Shashank Joshi is the defense editor of The Economist, and this is what he was tweeting in October 2023. I've been asked repeatedly and by serious people why the media circulated disinformation around Hamas beheading babies. So disinformation in quote marks. It was not disinformation. There was first-hand evidence from the start. You just didn't want to see it. On the 22nd of October, he doubled down, tweeting this. To every October 7th truther who has, for 2 weeks, denied the first-hand testimony that was already available and published, here is the head of Israel's National Forensic Medical Center. Many bodies, including those of babies, are without heads. Now, at the time when he tweeted that, I challenged Shashank on why no journalists have been shown any images, right? If we've got this quote, and this is evidence, you know, I'm not expecting the images to be published on Twitter, but the journalist should say, and we saw horrific images. No one did. It was all just based on quotes. He obviously said, I don't want to suggest what your ulterior motives might be. So he not only sort of amplified misinformation, which was being used to justify a genocide, he sort of accused anyone who questioned this very flimsy reporting of anti-Semitism is what was implied, let's face it. Let's go back to the interview, though, because this is the part that went most viral. It concerned the Economist editor asking Tucker Carlson whether Israel has a right to exist.
You are critical of the government of Israel. Do you believe in Israel's right to exist? Would you consider yourself a Zionist in that narrow definition?
What does that mean, a right to exist?
The existence of the political state of Israel as
but
it has
a right. What does that mean?
That you think it should continue in its existence as a state right now. So you do not agree with Iran, for example.
Well, let me just ask, since you asked me the question, it's fair for me to get you to define the term so I can answer it. You've asked two questions. The first was, do you believe Israel has a right to exist? And the second question was, do you believe Israel should continue to go on as a nation state? And those are very different questions. So I often hear the phrase... Having
been created as a political entity in 1948,
does it have a right to exist? Is that what you're asking?
I don't want to get hung up on the right. Should it continue to exist? That's how I define narrowly Zionism.
Because the phrase you used was devised by the Israeli government. Of course, does it have a right to exist? And so my question to you would be, what does that mean?
Why don't you answer my question? It's a very simple question.
I don't know what your question is. Are you asking, does it have a right to exist, or do I want it to exist? Do I seek its destruction?
Fine, answer it that way.
Well, of course I don't seek its destruction. I've already said, as you know, because I said it to you, I don't want Israel to be destroyed or have to use nuclear weapons.
We've established that you are in that narrow terms of Zionist. If that's how
I'm in no sense a Zionist. I don't want any country to be destroyed at all, and I don't want people to die, particularly ones who committed no crime, because I don't believe in killing innocents, period. That's the basis of Western civilization.
So therefore you are a Zionist. I mean, the whole Zionism, anti-Zionism, I just say I want, I don't want ethno-nationalism, I don't want genocide, I don't want ethnic cleansing, but I don't really care where the borders of various states are, because I'm not a Zionist, I'm not an Arab nationalist, I'm just like, let's sort of have some justice. I think go back to sort of international law is often the basis of it, but she's saying, you're a Zionist because you say, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? She's clearly quite uncomfortable. Let's look at the end of that conversation.
My question is, what right are you talking about? Does Britain have a right to exist? Does the United States have a right to exist?
There was a world order built up after 1945 which suggested that aggression should not be condoned into countries, that countries with borders have the right to continue.
I totally agree with that.
Okay.
Which is why the first thing that Israel did within 2 weeks of this war starting, which is supposedly existential for them, was take southern Lebanon, take someone else's country, as they have done repeatedly. And no one even mentions that. And so I guess I would be opposed to that, because I think Lebanon has a right to exist. I thought Gaza had a right to exist. But I noticed that as soon as we start apportioning rights, only one country gets them.
No, I did not say that. You're absolutely putting words into my mouth.
So because I believe, here's what I do believe, since you asked. I believe in universally applicable standards. And if they're not universally applicable, they're not standards, they're preferences. That's why I believe in human rights, not ethnic rights. I don't think Jews have more rights or less rights than anyone else. I don't think Christians have more rights or less rights, blacks, Filipinos. I believe in human rights that derive from the creation of people by God.
And I think this is the big problem for the kind of centrism that the Economist has found. I mean, it's always been tied to, and sort of being tied into the national security state. But backing this ethno-nationalist project that is sort of Israel, and it's very explicitly ethno-nationalist at the moment, and expansionary. I think if you want to be ethno-nationalist but you're not expansionary, there are vague things going on there. But you have a pretty fascist state, which is ethno-nationalist, which sort of stands against everything that liberalism stands for, and is sort of trying to destroy as many countries as possible in its neighborhood so it can be the last one standing. Right? The fact that liberalism has tied itself to Israel, or this form of sort of centrist liberalism, so closely to Israel, means that it can get outflanked on universal rights from Tucker Carlson. Now, Tucker Carlson, make no mistake, right? He, I think just in the last couple of weeks, made a video which was basically quite approving of Oswald Mosley. So the video was trying to demonize Winston Churchill. He was saying that Winston Churchill arrested Oswald Mosley. The only crime was that he opposed Churchill. He was putting Oswald Mosley as like an anti-war figure and saying that they called him unpatriotic when there was nothing unpatriotic about him. Now, he never mentioned in the video, also called him the main opposition party. He never mentioned in the video that he was a fascist. And I think the reason why, Tucker Carlson is sharing something which is implicitly praising Oswald Mosley without telling you he's a fascist is because he wants to launder fascists, right? He's had people on his podcast where they've been arguing that the real baddie of the Second World War was Winston Churchill, not Adolf Hitler. Now, obviously, our audience don't need being told that Winston Churchill was no angel. But in that war, he was the good guy, right? If you're trying to relitigate the Second World War, which is something that Tucker Carlson sometimes sort of seems to flirt with, you shouldn't be winning an argument against the Economist editor about sort of equal rights, regardless of ethnicity. But on Israel, he does have them snookered. And I think it is a real problem for the brand of the kind of centrist liberalism that The Economist represents.
Yeah, well, on the centrism, it's kind of like it's that age-old thing of progressive except Palestine, right? We've seen that from the center a lot before. Tucker Carlson's politics are all over the place, it seems, right now. And yes, he does often launder fascism. So it's odd for us to find ourselves in a position where we're kind of lauding Tucker Carlson here. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, again, in the US, we're seeing sympathy for the Palestinians surge like never before. And we are seeing some of Trump's MAGA base realize that he has not pursued his America first policy. And I think that they are starting to criticize it slowly. But I'm really glad that this clip went viral because I think that there is so much that's interesting about it, and there is so much that it says about mainstream journalism and centrism and propaganda talking points, etc. So let's just pause for a second on the right to exist question. Does Israel have a right to exist? It's a nonsense question. It's an absurd question. It's pure propaganda. It's effectively stratcoms. The Israeli government came up with it. No other country is ever told that it has a right to exist. Does the UK have a right to exist? Does Ireland have a right to exist? Does Northern Ireland have a right to exist? Did the former Yugoslavia have a right to exist? Does South Sudan, the world's youngest country formed in 2011, have a right to exist? I think that Francesca Albanese put it brilliantly about a year ago when she said, look, the premise of the question is absurd. Does it have a right to exist? It exists. It is a fact that it exists as a nation recognized by the UN. But there is nothing in international law to say that a nation has the right to exist. What there is in international law is something to say that peoples have a right to exist. And what there is in international law is something that says that people have the right to self-determination. So Israel's quote-unquote right to exist, the fact of Israel's existence, doesn't give it the right to run an apartheid state and to perpetrate a genocide against the Palestinian people. But I also think what Tucker Carlson's pushback shows is that there are a growing number of people from all sides of the political spectrum who have now got the confidence to push back against these long-standing talking points, whether it's Israel has a right to exist or Israel has a right to defend itself. People are pushing back on the very premise of the question. I think that's super interesting. And what you see is that when people push back, there's utter confusion from the person asking the question. Like the editor of The Economist there, she had this kind of quizzical, furrow-browed, confused expression when he asked her what did she mean by that. And she was looking at Tucker Carlson like he was playing a trick, like he was engaging in a negotiating tactic, like he was the one who was going for the gotcha moment, when she was the one playing the trick, when she was the one going for the gotcha. But it's like she couldn't even realize that, because for years and years, mainstream journalists and the kind of people who rise to a position like she occupies have imbibed and grown up with and absorbed the talking points of the Israeli government, the talking points of the British government, the talking points of the US government. And what they do is they believe those talking points to be fact, right? And so they think, and people in the comments will have a go at me and say, no, they're deliberately lying. Yes, sometimes. But really, a lot of the time what happens is senior Western journalists fully believe that they're wielding the trusty sword of truth, even though all they're doing is echoing propaganda and stratcoms. Can I tell you a story?
Go on.
Back in 2017, I happened to be in a newsroom on the day that Martin McGuinness died. Now, just in case any of our audience doesn't know who he was, Martin McGuinness was a former commander of the IRA. He was also a former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. He was also the former Education Minister of Northern Ireland. And he's somebody who's credited alongside other people with being a key figure to getting the Good Friday Agreement done in Northern Ireland. The day he died, in that newsroom, it was going to be the lead story. In the newsroom that day, by a coincidence, almost every journalist was British. The presenter on the day was British. I watched them lose their minds about how to describe Martin McGuinness. They went back and forward, they argued, they debated. First of all, they said, should we call him a terrorist? Somebody pointed out, well, I said, we don't say the word terrorist. They said, okay, what if we call him a paramilitary? No, I'm not sure. What if we call him a militant? And then somebody piped up and said, oh, how about we call him a self-confessed terrorist? I watched this in amazement, right? Because we had a clear style guide. We did not say the word terrorist. We did not call people a terrorist group. We called them an armed group. We did not say militant. We did not say paramilitary. If you were a fighter in a group, you were called a fighter of the group. If you were a leader of the group, you were called a leader of the group. Now, that was a policy that we applied to Al-Shabaab, to Al-Qaeda, to FARC in Colombia. It didn't matter. That was the editorial policy. But when these British journalists were faced with reporting on the IRA, the editorial policy went out the window. Such was the kind of the propaganda that they'd been raised with, because they had spent their entire lives watching BBC's coverage of Northern Ireland. They had spent their whole time watching British coverage of Northern Ireland. They had spent their whole time being told one particular thing about the Northern Ireland conflict, and they had been taught a way to frame it that in that moment led to them being unable to stick by the basic rules that we had as a news organisation. Now, that is the same cloth that Zanny Minton Beddoes is cut from as a senior British mainstream journalist. She has a view of the world, and her view is that Israel is a good faith actor, that Israel does not deliberately target civilians, that Israel does not deliberately kill children, that Israel is not and would never be engaged in a genocide. And she thinks, as she showed in the way that she looked at Tucker Carlson, she thinks that everybody who thinks different is biased, never recognizing that she's the biased one.
I think it is I think the Israel thing is a bigger problem for liberalism. And I'll explain why. Because with the IRA, like, liberalism has always found it very easy to say, look, we're in favor of self-determination and justice, but also we're against political violence. And if Irish Republicans wanted independence, they should have done it at the ballot box, right? There's lots of arguments against that, but most of the arguments against that are quite radical arguments, right? So liberalism, I don't think, really struggled with sort of being opposed to armed groups in liberal democracies. I mean, you can say Northern Ireland wasn't quite a liberal democracy, but you see where I'm going with
Definitely
this.
Wasn't.
They can make that argument quite confidently. I think Israel, especially now, has become, it's not opposing what Israel is doing now is not a radical thing. Like, liberalism really should be so against this right now. You've got an expansionary ethno-state. Like, liberalism, its justification through time has been it believes in individual rights. The biggest justification has been that standards of living have improved. But then also, it was liberalism alongside communism that defeated the Nazis. So they can say, we're against the ethno-nationalists. The Americans were generally supportive of decolonization, even if they then went and couped a few leaders who they didn't quite believe in. But there was an argument that they could put forward, which was to say, we are the most powerful force that has raised living standards and that is against reactionary ethno-nationalism. And now it's found itself so closely allied with this state, with this project, which is so clearly expansionary and ethno-nationalist, that it's just discrediting of the entire thing. And I feel like some of them are waking up to the fact that associating their brand with Israel, obviously there are always contradictions in what liberals support and don't support. And when it was the Israel run by the Labour Party, the Israeli Labour Party, I think probably those contradictions could somewhat be smoothed over, not necessarily ethically, but politically. Now they just can't. And I think this is going to really do some damage to centrist liberalism, which has its problems, but has also been in many ways a force for good. I feel like them going down with Israel we're not necessarily going to like what comes afterwards if that's what happens next.
Watch everyone slamming you for defending centrism.
Yeah, well, I'm a much more. I'm Novara Media's moderate.
No, you're right. In that, I mean, I would say that, the West or Western countries supported decolonization and then under the table went right back into neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. I know you know that. We all know that, right? But I think that it is a problem for liberals or so-called liberals and centrists because, look, the Democrats have never seen an Israeli action against Palestinians that they didn't like. Ultimately, Labour hasn't in recent years really seen an Israeli attack on Palestinians that they had a major problem with. And now we are in the midst of a genocide. A genocide, as everybody often points out, something that's been deemed a genocide by most, if not every, authoritative genocide scholar in the world, including Israelis. That's been deemed a genocide by the Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, and you can go on and on and on and on. Isn't it crazy that it might have taken a genocide for liberals and centrists to realize that they have a problem with their support for Israel? And, even the defense editor from The Economist, who you had the spat with on Twitter over the weekend, he's now started to delete his tweets, right? He's deleted some of the tweets to you, right?
Yeah, all my conversations. So the conversation was in 2023 and he's deleted all his parts of the exchange.
Yeah, so he's scared, isn't he? He's frightened that, these tweets are going to be pulled up.
History isn't going to look back kindly on his support here.
That will show that he bought into the beheaded babies thing, which we all know was complete nonsense. And I think I said on Twitter yesterday, it smelled bad from the beginning. And he is, as a journalist for one of the most prestigious news organizations, or one of the most prestigious sort of newspapers, magazines on the planet. And it was obvious to anybody with professional journalism training, anybody who'd worked in news, that story, as reported, was full of holes. Even the mass rape story, when Screams Without Words came out in the New York Times, just on a pure reading of the text as a journalist, when you looked at the sourcing, it was awful. I couldn't believe that it even got through the editing process. Now, Shashank Joshi is a very experienced journalist. How did he not realize that? Because the burden of proof when it comes to reporting on Palestine is just not bloody there. But I think the fact that he's deleting his tweets and the fact that people are starting to backtrack a little bit, liberals and centrists and so-called progressives, shows that they're getting worried.
I meant to do this today, but I didn't get around to it. So I'm cheating and I've asked ChatGPT, did The Economist support apartheid South Africa? Short answer, yes, at times. So in the early and the mid 20th century, they took a pro-free market, anti-sanctions stance. They said that economic growth would liberalize South Africa. Then in the 70s and the 80s, at the height of the global anti-apartheid movement, they did criticize apartheid as morally wrong, but continued to oppose sanctions and divestment campaigns, favoring dialogue. And then in the late 80s and 1990s, they became more clearly supportive of major political reform. So
why are you doing a Matt Goodwin?
Maybe there's that's what, I haven't. Matt Goodwin has written a book where lots of the references are ChatGPT, and lots of people are accusing him of hallucinating them. I think reading from ChatGPT when you're clear you're reading from ChatGPT on YouTube, I'd say is more legitimate than writing it in your book and trying to pass it off as not from ChatGPT.